What is Ukraine fighting for? Maybe for joining NATO? Maybe for the European Union or for a well-fed life? Maybe in order to destroy Russia within the framework of the Anglo-Saxon project, anti-Russia? Or maybe for the personal ambitions of Vladimir Zelensky? In fact, many have forgotten, but Ukraine is fighting for its life. Literally. This is not a metaphor. Russia came to the territory of Ukraine to destroy it. Vladimir Putin does not want this state to continue exist. Now that Russian troops are squeezed, plus or minus, on one line front, and when Russia is not storming large densely populated cities, people have forgotten what happened in the first year that Vladimir Putin calls it a special military operation. We forgot how the Russian army shelled residential buildings in huge, giant scale. Not just missiles every few days, but fires from everything that perhaps in apartment buildings with dozens of people in them. People have forgotten about the time when the number of civilians killed was counting hundreds. People have forgotten how Russia wipes out entire cities, large, alive, densely populated. People forgot this for two reasons. Because, firstly, the Ukrainian army was able to push back the army Russian, was able to liberate a large number of territories, including those where the Russian army tortured and killed people, including the city of Kherson. Same. Which are constantly adjacent to war, but the disadvantage is that people forget why this war is going on and what is at stake. Today I want to remind you of this by telling the story of Mariupol. It would seem that there is no need to tell her, it happened quite recently, but there is a clear feeling that people have forgotten what the Russian army is and what she does when she comes to the Ukrainian city. People have forgotten how hundreds and thousands of civilians were killed Russian troops. People have forgotten what a city is like without electricity, fire and everything, where people fry food on fires. Will bury their relatives and friends in their own yard, because leaving almost impossible. Human Rights Watch has released a large project, which, unfortunately, went almost unnoticed. They collected a huge amount of evidence, photographs, videos, what happened in Mariupol. I will leave a link to this project in the description, please go and look. They really tried, judging by what I saw. A huge amount of effort has really been invested there, and not just on text, but for everything together. That is, it's a whole one, including visual project. When I got acquainted with it, all these pictures again appeared in front of my eyes. Because I observed this on a daily basis, since Ruslan Leviev made reports, again, in this daily mode. And when you remember all this, when you refresh it all, you remember what we are talking about now, what is at stake, then you begin to hate even more all the useful idiots who help Vladimir Putin continue to destroy Ukraine. And let's remember together today what happened to Mariupol and what there is actually happening now. You can help remind people of this by liking, subscribing, by writing a comment. All these things help promote the video. You yourself know this very well. Or launch a Human Rights Watch publication, because this really very worthy material, which, in my opinion, completely unfairly deprived of attention. The video will be long, but please watch it to the end. So, the history of the capture of Mariupol. Where charred ruins remain today, there once stood blooming city. Before Russian troops began their assault on Mariupol, the modern city in the southeast of Ukraine was home to approximately 540,000 human. Occupying strategically important positions on the coast of the Azov Sea, Mariupol was an important cultural and industrial center. In the warm season, Mariupol residents rested on city beaches and under the cries of seagulls splashed in the shallow water. They were walking with the children in the main city park. While children played on the playgrounds, adults admired the tulips and sea views. In the center of the city there was a red and white brick building of an old water tower, near which people often appointed each other meeting. The city often hosted various festivals, for example, Gogolfest. People came from all over the country to Mariupol to watch the performances regional drama theater or attend a concert at the Chamber Philharmonic. Two largest metallurgical plants were located in Mariupol. City authorities have invested hundreds of millions of dollars in construction roads and parks, creation of a modern public transport system. The sea was both a calling card and a pledge for Mariupol further development. It is through the Mariupol port, one of the largest in the entire region, Ukraine supplied its coal, steel and grain to various parts of the world. On February 24, 2022, the full-scale Russian invasion began. Fighting between the Ukrainian armed forces and the advancing units continued for almost 3 months. AFRF and pro-Russian armed formations from the occupied regions of Donbass. For Russia, the capture of Mariupol was of strategic importance. By occupying the territory west of the city, the Kremlin received a land corridor between Crimea and Donbass. By the 2nd of March, Russian forces had surrounded Mariupol. Russian troops and pro-Russian formations began to advance towards city center. The city was bombed from the air, shelled from tanks, mortars and heavy artillery. Many residents were forced to leave their homes and move to dark basements. By the beginning of March, approximately 450,000 people remained in the city, who either they couldn't or didn't want to leave, afraid to leave their loved ones at home and normal life. During the fighting, many critical facilities were damaged infrastructure. Mariupol was left without electricity, water supply, heating and communications. In fact, the city was on the verge of survival. By April 13, the occupation forces already controlled most of cities. On April 21, Russia officially announced the capture of Mariupol. On May 17, Ukrainian soldiers who had taken refuge in the territory began to surrender Azovstal plant. From that moment on, the city completely came under the control of Russian forces. The fighting changed the city beyond recognition. There were temporary graves in the courtyards, in which people were hastily buried. Dead. During the assault, thousands of civilians died in the city. Some came under fire, others died from some other reasons. In terms of the scale of destruction, Mariupol is one of the most affected Ukrainian cities. Human Rights Watch, City Research and True Hounds conducted a joint project to record the damage caused in Mariupol. Not being able to collect information directly on site events in Mariupol, they write, used evidence from hundreds of residents who left the city, whom we interviewed in person or by telephone. In addition, we processed 850 photographs and videos, checking them for reliability and making sure using geolocation methods that they were taken precisely in Mariupol. To estimate the death toll, the authors analyzed satellite data photographs of the cemetery. We assessed the scale of destruction in the city center, not using methods remote collection of information. Each quarter was analyzed separately. A separate investigation was carried out to establish specific Russian formations and specific commanders who may be involved in committing war crimes. In their work, the authors focused on destruction along the central city streets, Mira Avenue. The authors studied an area of approximately 14 square kilometers, which corresponds to a quarter of the total territory of the city. In this area they examined 4,884 damaged or completely destroyed buildings. To clearly show the scale of destruction, they built three-dimensional models of 7 buildings in this part of the city. The Russian occupation authorities have already begun demolishing the damaged buildings. In June 22 years. Each of these 7 buildings was special in its own way and personified that or another side of life in Mariupol. One building is an apartment building in which hundreds of people lived, representatives of different generations. The other was a hospital where people came for treatment. There was a maternity hospital at the hospital where women came to give birth. Another building is a university where students discovered the world and mastered various skills to help their city in the future develop. Cozy private house in a quiet area, commercial building in a noisy area street that housed a bank, a shopping center and a playground for children. A majestic building in the city center in the neoclassical style and, finally, the drama theater, the heart of Mariupol, the city where art has always been held in high esteem. When the war came to Mariupol, these buildings lost their individuality. Instead of fulfilling their function, they first turned into refuge and then to a place of suffering and death. 2 years have passed since the assault on Mariupol. The attention of the world community has in many ways already shifted to other hotspots in this bloody war or in conflicts in other countries. But for the residents of Mariupol, life never returned to normal. The Mariupol they knew is actually larger. the Russian occupation authorities are demolishing the destroyed buildings and place, between the mass graves and the Sea of Azov, they are building a new city with Russian face. Those responsible for what happened here have never been brought to justice. Responsibility. Justice was never restored. Some of the victims want to forget about everything that happened as soon as possible. Happened and start a new life. Many are looking forward to the city being under control again. Ukraine, when compensation will be paid and when the perpetrators will be held accountable, deserved punishment. The goal of this project is to document what happened in order to help the triumph of justice, as well as to record at least part of what was lost, so that it is not forgotten. At the beginning of March, people circled menacingly over the house on Metropolitan Street 98 planes, artillery roared, and the area was shelled from tanks. 3-year-old Arina Antipenko, Arishal, was playing with toys in the basement of the building. As her grandmother called her, "Dim, look, I'm a princess," the girl said with a smile to her 22-year-old neighbor Dmitry Lastenko, "inviting you to play." Many of those who lived on Metropolitan Street, an alley in the central parts of Mariupol, decided, despite the darkness and dampness, to take refuge in basements. The basement of a multi-story building turned out to be the safest shelter. Shortly before this, city authorities published a list of places where you can hide during shelling. The list contained several hundred addresses, including this one basement. Irina and her parents, Ivan and Kristina, lived nearby and also moved to the basement. Wrapped in a blanket, they sat on the floor with other people and they quietly prayed that all this horror would end soon. Some of those sitting in the basement filmed what was happening on their phones. From time to time, people went outside for a short time in the cold and snowstorm, to get water to drink or cook food over a fire. On March 11, Irina was, as usual, in the basement, dancing and playing. Entrepreneur Daniil tells what he was taping that day neighboring house windows. At about 3 o'clock in the afternoon he heard the sound of an approaching plane. Frightened, Danila ran out into the corridor. There was an explosion. The glass in the windows shattered into many pieces. An air bomb brought down the central section of an apartment building Metropolitan, 98, in the center of Mariupol. In the part of the city that the authors decided to focus on in their work, 93% of apartment buildings were damaged by bombing and shelling. Russian troops used these tactics in other cities of Ukraine, for example, in Izium. There, too, apparently, they deliberately dropped bombs on apartment buildings, resulting in the death of a large number of civilians. During the entire time that the battles for Mariupol continued, top-level Russian military leaders, including the President Vladimir Putin, Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and Chief of the General Staff Valery Gerasimov apparently knew in detail about the situation in the city and took part in the preparation to the implementation of plans for its capture and in coordinating the actions of various divisions. President Putin personally gave the orders. In addition, the command of the troops was carried out by senior officers, general staff and other military leaders, including the director of the Russian Guard Viktor Zolotov and General Alexander Dvornikov, who at that time commanded the troops of the Southern Military District. These commanders were most likely also involved in decision-making high level. In the house on Metropolitan, 98, all 5 floors collapsed in the central sections of the building. People were buried under the rubble. The concrete walls folded like a house of cards. Taped walls in living rooms, tiled walls in rooms. At one moment everything turned into a pile of ruins. From the third entrance, next to which people cooked food every day, nothing left. As Pavel tells it, the man who helped clear the rubble and to remove the bodies of the dead, a massive rubble was formed 25 meters. The surviving people, unable to get out of the building, called for help. The neighbors heard their moans. Part of the building was engulfed in fire. Firefighters arrived, but due to the fact that the area continued shelled, were forced to leave. One woman, not wanting to die in the fire and smoke, jumped out from the 5th floors and fell to her death. Her granddaughter spoke about this on a website specially created in memory of dead. In the basement there were dead bodies lying on the floor. From the room in which Irina and her family hid for several days, nothing left. The explosion scattered people's belongings, and some objects hung on branches, trees around the house. The smell of burnt bodies was in the air. The survivors emerged from the smoking basement in shock. Since there was no electricity and telephones did not work, many were forced to turn to strangers on the internet asking for help find their loved ones. Are they alive? Someone asked in a local Telegram chat in March 22 about Irina and her family. Attached to the message were several family photographs. Smiling Irina in a blue festive dress with a blue bow on head, her parents, Ivan and Christina, hugging against the New Year's background Christmas trees, and Ivan's mother, Svetlana. Telegram chats were filled with messages from people who were looking for family and friends. From different parts of the city, more and more messages were received about that another house was destroyed, another shelter, and thousands of people were damaged tried to find their loved ones. For many, this search lasted for months. Some are still looking for their relatives. There was no information about the Antipenko family. On April 24, 22, on Orthodox Easter, a group of men who Russian occupation authorities ordered the removal of the rubble and protected dead, found at 98 Metropolitan Street, body child. Pavel, who joined this group as a volunteer, didn't work for a day. He knew that the child's body would be found because survivors told him that neither Irina nor her relatives ever got out from under the rubble. In total, over several weeks of work in April, Pavel and the team recovered 17 bodies and fragments of the bodies of the dead from the rubble. Among them was the body of a little girl. As they told Pavel, another working girl looked to be 3-5 years old. She was found next to bodies that matched the description of family members. Antipenko, a man in dark clothes, a woman in jeans, and an older woman in pink robe. But was it really Irina? In May, 2 months after the tragedy, Dmitry Lastenko, who the moment the bomb hit was in the basement, returned to the ruins to try to find your documents. He took a shovel and started digging. The smell of death was in the air. Shreds of hair, pieces of blankets, and a telephone with cracked screen. Dmitry recognized him immediately. It was the phone number of Irina's mother, Christina. Dmitry gave it to his mother, Christina Stefani, who lives in another city. There are 3 unsent messages left on the phone dated March 6, 22. They said, "Mommy, I'm alive, I'm fine, I love you. Stefania tried several times to come to Mariupol to try to find your relatives. But the Russian military refused to let her through. On April 15, she finally managed to get into the city, and long months began searches. She walked around the entire area where her daughter lived, showing people photographs. Missing relatives. I went into different basements and called them by name," says Stephanie. There were still some people hiding in the basements. It was dark, you couldn't see their faces, so I screamed. Stefania returned to the ruins of the house on Metropolitan, 98. Pieces of blankets and clothing were sticking out from under the rubble and reinforcement. Stefania managed to find some things belonging to her relatives' marriage certificates of Ivan and Christina, hat of Christina and Arina birth certificates. For several months, Stefania came to the temporary morgue again and again, where the bodies of the dead from all over the city were taken. Trying in vain to find her relatives, she spent a long time examining partially decomposed corpses of men, women, and children. Some bodies lay in the morgue courtyard in black plastic bags. Some of those who were exhumed were spread out on blankets. Nearby lay the dead people's belongings, clothes and shoes, piled up in a heap. Wooden coffins prepared for burial stood separately. Stefania went to the morgue almost like going to work, because if some body was not taken by relatives, then after 2-3 days it was buried in a common grave. Stefania was very afraid that the bodies of her loved ones would be brought to the morgue, but she didn't have time to pick them up. We usually did it this way. One day you go to the morgue, then another day you come to your senses after everything this horror, then you go again, says Stefania. In September, Stefania finally found a photo of Irina's body in the database, which the occupation authorities created to count those killed in the city of people. She had an earring in the shape of a crown, Stefania says. I recognized her by her teeth and clothes. I know her things. Irina was listed in the database under number 1734. Stefania went to the main cemetery of Mariupol in Starokrim, and found the grave with the number 1734. But next to the cross on the grave there was a photograph of another little girl's. It wasn't Irina. The girl's name was Eva. As Stefania was told, the car in which Eva's family was traveling fired it, and the girl died. Eva's relatives mistakenly mistook Irina's body for their own girl's. But Stefania also dreamed that she heard Irina's moans from incorrectly marked grave. Only on October 5, Stefania finally managed to find her granddaughter's body. A week before, Eva's relatives dug up the girl's body in Starokrimsky Cemetery and reburied him at Novotroitsky Cemetery, approximately 2.5 kilometers northeast of Levoberezhny district. With the permission of the occupation authorities, Stefania exhumed Irina, who was buried in a black plastic bag inside a small coffin, and reburied her in her homeland, in another Ukrainian city. The bodies of Irina's parents, Christina and Ivan, as well as the bodies of Ivan's mother Svetlana, could not be found. Stefania says she will continue searching until she finds it. Are listed as missing. Their remains are lost among the remains of thousands of other people. On July 19, 22, Stefania handed over samples of her DNA. She was told that the DNA of the remains would be compared with the DNA of relatives and that this process could take a year or even more. At the time of publication of this report, Stefania had not received DNA analysis results. I used to be a mother and grandmother. Now I'm nobody, Stefania complains. For me, family was my main treasure. I lived joyfully and happily, and now there is nothing left. I pray to God for only one thing. Find the bodies of the children and bury them so that they are next to me. This is not the first time war has come to Mariupol. From 41 to 43, the city was occupied by German troops. The Nazis killed or deported thousands of people, mostly representatives of the Jewish community. Now the grandchildren of those who survived then had to endure the horrors of armed conflict. In the summer of 2014, fighting raged for 5 weeks in certain areas of Mariupol, between pro-Russian formations and Ukrainian government troops. Since then, residents of Mariupol have lived in the front-line zone. They are accustomed to the sound of cannonade periodically reaching them, but still people hoped, and some were even absolutely sure, that Mariupol is an impregnable fortress. No one could even imagine that 8 years later their neighbors would be killed in the street before their eyes. Their loved ones will die under rubble in the basements, that Mariupol will come under Russian control. Every street there is soaked in blood, pain and horror, says a resident of Mariupol who left the city. This trauma will remain for many, many years, maybe even several generations. In 1 or 2 weeks the city changed beyond recognition. City blocks turned into battlefields, and in front of hundreds of thousands the townspeople remaining in Mariupol were asked the same question. How can they survive? The green building of Hospital No. 3, the main hospital of Mariupol for women and children. This is a modern medical center with a bright interior and high-quality equipment. People came here to give birth, seek gynecological help, brought sick children. When Russian troops began their assault on Mariupol, many city residents they thought that they would be safe on the hospital grounds. And dozens of people, men, women and children, took refuge in the underground bomb shelter at the hospital, which is located on the south side of the oncology building. Many spent several weeks in this shelter. It was an old shelter, reliable, but cold, says Rustam, who worked in a hospital as a laboratory assistant and took refuge in a bunker with wife and daughter. At night the temperature dropped below zero. During the day there was almost no warmth from the sun and it was very cold in the bomb shelter. Hospital employees remained at work and continued care for patients, including pregnant women and sick or injured children. In a dark bomb shelter, life turned into a constant struggle for survival. To survive, patience, calculation and luck were required. I had to fight for literally every little thing. Where can I get water to drink and wash? Where can I get food to eat? Where can I get medicine to treat wounds? How to go to the toilet? On March 9, at approximately 14.50, people living in neighboring houses heard a rumble airplane. Why the powerful explosion that broke the glass in the windows? Car alarms went off and plumes of smoke rose into the sky. The blast wave was such that I was thrown into the air, says Demian, who lives 400 meters from the maternity ward. Apparently, the blow was deliberately inflicted on the sick leave complex. As a result of the explosion, maternity wards and children's wards were damaged. Diagnostic center, a deep crater remained on the hospital grounds. Hospital No. 3 is one of 19 hospitals in Mariupol affected by during the battles. As reported by the Office of the UN High Commissioner, according to Human Rights, by the end of March 2022, all hospitals in Mariupol practically stopped their work. After the explosion, patients and hospital staff ran out into the courtyard. Police officers and volunteers carried a wounded pregnant woman on a stretcher. Woman, Irina Kalinina. Writhing in pain, she held her stomach, there was blood on her clothes. A few hours later Irina died. Her child also died. As reported, Irina had a caesarean section, but the child did not give signs of life. On March 10, Ukrainian authorities announced that the bombing had killed at least 2 adults and 1 more child. Another 17 people from among the patients and hospital staff received injuries. Hospital staff transported the patient to other medical facilities, institutions, but some of them were also damaged during the shelling. Some of the people after the bombing went down to the underground bomb shelter at hospital. According to one eyewitness, there were at least 57 people in the bunker. People including 30 children in the hospital and wounded children who were undergoing treatment at the time of the bombing treatment in hospital. Some children were alone, without parents. It was dark and cold for us. People breathed in so much that the air was very damp, says Diana, who was in a bomb shelter and cared for wounded civilians. Everything around is wet. At night I wrapped myself in several blankets at once, because they were all disgustingly wet and cold. Doctors performed simple operations, bandaged wounds, injections, fragments were removed. One man's arm had to be amputated with a bayonet. Garbage and other waste, including excrement, was carried out and dumped on the ramp leading to the underground bomb shelter. There, as Diana says, the remains of the dead were taken out, including the body of a girl who died in a bomb shelter. The shelling of the hospital complex continued throughout March. From the blast wave, the heavy metal door leading into the bunker, how it rumbled, and the people inside had to do something, make things up to distract children. To somehow cheer them up, we came up with various simple errands, such as sorting pillows. They took up the task with enthusiasm and diligently completed every task, says Rustam, whose wife worked at the hospital. Since no food was brought into the city, and shops practically did not work, the residents of Mariupol had to eat either reserves that they had left, or hope that with them someone in the shelter will share food. Some people sometimes went out into the street and, risking their lives, tried to find food in neighboring houses. There wasn't enough food. 2 oranges had to be divided among 20 people, and a dinner of boiled potatoes and cans of stew were divided among several dozen people. Volunteers who sometimes left the bunker to look for food and water or restart the generators were forced to hear the sound in the skyplane or drone, run to shelter again. Thousands of people throughout the city were in the same difficult conditions, desperately trying to survive. If it weren't for the help of volunteers, we would all probably die of hunger, Diana says. Hungry children cried almost all the time, she says. The water supply did not work, so people took water wherever they could find it. Some from the fire hydrants, some were putting out buckets in the rain, some melted the snow. Someone, risking getting caught in the fire, ran to the spring or a well. Going for water was very dangerous. Some of those who went in search of water never returned. Those who hid in the hospital's bomb shelter were, one might say, lucky. There was a big old tank of water in the room, although no one knew how long has this water stood. And in the park nearby there was a well, but it was not safe to go there either. The road to the well was strewn with corpses, says Diana. Those who were brave enough to go to the well often returned to us already as patients, without an arm or a leg. On March 9, a few minutes before Hospital Number 3 was dropped bomb, Mikhail Purushev heard the sound approaching plane. "Let's run!" Mikhail shouted along with a group of other people, ran into building of the Azov State Technical University, one of the oldest educational institutions in the region. Running for cover, Mikhail continued filming, pointing his phone camera to myself. The moment of the explosion can be heard on the video. At the same time, Mikhail was thrown forward by the blast wave. After this, another explosion sounded. It was the university that was bombed. "Everyone down, carefully," Mikhail shouted. The blast wave threw him inside the building. It was difficult to breathe. It became dark around. You could hear a man swearing and a child crying somewhere nearby. Before the war, there were about 200 educational institutions operating at the university. Programs. Future engineers, metallurgists, transport workers, economists and IT specialists. Mikhail was the owner of a nearby University Evo restaurant, where young people gathered to play video games and listen to music. Students often went there to have a snack, between classes or chat with friends, but that morning there was no one there did not have. They no longer studied in the university building, but hid. Hundreds of people took refuge in the classrooms and corridors of the basement. To get a drink of water, people broke the heating system and drank from radiators. I went out into the street and saw that it was simply terrible there, says Mikhail. For the first time in my life I cried. According to preliminary data, at least 2 civilians were killed in the bombing residence and at least 1 other person was injured. The university building received significant damage. Mikhail Purushev was one of the many townspeople who recorded destruction in Mariupol and posted their photos and videos on Telegram, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook and other social networks. Thus, they wanted to tell the world what was happening in their city and preserve for themselves the memory of what they experienced. In some cases, People recorded videos to say goodbye to loved ones because they had no hope of surviving. Complete air supremacy, says Mikhail, about the Russian aerospace forces. And they could do whatever they wanted. Having analyzed using satellite images and information from public sources of destruction in the central part of Mariupol, authors of the report found that out of 89 educational institutions in the city, 86 were damaged. Out of 15, all 15 universities were affected, and 71 out of 74 schools were affected. Azov State Technical University was forced to move 300 kilometers to the Dnieper. Despite the war, classes continue, partly in person, partly remotely. During the entire time that Russian troops stormed Mariupol, use of explosive weapons in densely populated areas led to numerous casualties among civilians, destruction of civilian objects, and, in general, aggravated the suffering of civilians' population. In particular, the city was constantly shelled from tanks, heavy artillery, mortars and rocket defense, and were subjected to missile and bomb attacks. Explosive weapons, as a rule, it has a large damage radius and, by definition, does not designed for high-precision strikes. In some cases, the blow is delivered not by one, but by several at once. Ammunition. The consequences of the use of such weapons are not limited to the fact that peaceful residents die and are injured directly at the time of its applications. The use of these weapons also has long-term consequences, such as damaged infrastructure, deep psychological trauma, environmental damage and forced displacement of civilians' population. The destructive effect of this weapon was clearly demonstrated upon impact. In Subhouse 67 on Mariupolskaya Balka Street, which is located just 10 minutes walk from the Azov State Technical University. In this area, among the trees and tram tracks, there were cozy private houses with bright metal gates. A bright red tram was moving around the area. Eyewitnesses say that as a result of the shelling, the area was completely. At least 15 houses were destroyed. On March 10, 22, Vladislav slept with his family in the basement of his house. Around midnight, he heard something hit the ground above them. His neighbor, Dr. Solomea, says that at about the same time for a while she heard the sound of a flying plane, after which there was a powerful explosion. She saw a bright flash, and then the house shook from the blast wave. The ceiling fell right on the heads of Vladislav and his family. The shed in the yard was blown to pieces. Some pieces of it flew into living room. One of the doors in the living room was all broken, he says. There were no windows or doors left. No people were hurt. A fire started in the house opposite. I helped the guy who lived there and his mother-in-law get out of the house, Vladislav says. But his wife and her sister were crushed by the falling roof. They screamed and called for help, but in the end they burned to death. In a neighboring house, someone was calling for help. Salome grabbed a rag to apply a tourniquet if necessary and ran out into the street. There is nothing left of the house opposite. The neighbor's legs were blown off. He begged Salome to save a 12-year-old girl lying nearby, who had my legs were crushed by a falling wall. Salome managed to save the man's life, but his legs subsequently had to be amputated. The girl did not survive. Mariupolskaya Balka is just one of many areas victims of the use of explosive weapons. Having analyzed satellite images, as well as those published on the internet, photographs and video recordings of which the authors of the report were able to confirm, they came to the conclusion that in the central part of Mariupol, which they chose to focus on in their work, 54% were affected buildings. This is 4,884 out of 9,043. Of the multi-apartment buildings, 93% were damaged, and of single-story private houses, such as the house on Mariupolskaya Balka, are almost half. In June 22, a journalist working for the Russian state TV channel posted a video on social networks in which workers in protective suits pass through the once cozy breaks. Onions marina beams. Passing by a mangled blue bicycle, they are carried on a stretcher remains that had lain for several months in destroyed houses. Throughout the city, entire areas were transformed before the eyes of residents. On the battlefield, and then in the cemetery. On March 8, 22, Stanislav, despite the danger, left his house on the seashore to take food to a disabled friend. The 5-story building was located about 1.5 kilometers from the house 67 along Mariupolskaya Balka. Nearby there were banks, shops, a shopping center and a children's area. Later that day, Stanislav went out with a friend to smoke. Explosions roared somewhere in the distance. Looking around, Stanislav saw that in front of the 3-story building along the Trading on Street 20 there are 3 women standing, and with them a boy and a girl. The boy looked about 10 years old, and the girl looked 12. Suddenly there was a sound as if something was falling from the sky, Stanislav says. The sound was slow and heavy. I didn't understand where he was coming from. I did not see any military personnel or equipment. Then Stanislav saw a bright flash, and then clouds of smoke. As if in slow motion, the roof of the neighboring house collapsed. Stanislav and his friend rushed to run. After 10 minutes they returned to see if there were any casualties. I saw 5 bodies on the ground, says Stanislav. He recognized them as the 3 women and 2 children he had met before. Stanislav did not want to leave them on the street. Together with a friend, they transferred the bodies of the children to the playground through the road. There was a sandbox and a shelter. It turned out to be a very primitive temporary grave, but it was the best thing they could do at that moment. It was unsafe to be outside. Just a few weeks ago children were playing on this playground, but now mutilated children's bodies lay. While the fighting was going on, people often did not have the opportunity to bury their loved ones or simply dead. Sometimes the bodies were simply buried in the yard of a house or on a football field and they placed a homemade wooden cross on the temporary grave. Sometimes, when the front line was very close, they dug trench and buried 200 bodies in it at once. Death was everywhere in Mariupol. It was impossible to hide from her. The bodies of the dead lay everywhere, lay on the street, in apartments, in temporary graves. Radislav, a 46-year-old boiler operator who maintained the local system heating, was afraid of dying. But on March 22 he was very hungry, and he decided to go outside, to cook borscht. It was in the courtyard of the house at 42 Mira Avenue. The house stood opposite the drama theater. The building is typical for the mid-20th century high ceilings and large windows. Friend, I heard something hit the house, from the other side, from the side theater, says Rostislav. I saw the whole building shake. A man ran out of the building and shouted that the house had been hit and there was food inside people who need help. Rostislav and 2 other men rushed inside. They went up to the 3rd floor, into a destroyed apartment. There Rostislav discovered Denis and Azia, a married couple with whom Rostislav hid in the basement together. They were in their 30s. A few minutes before the hit, Denis and Azia had just risen to apartment to take some things. They left the children in the basement with their grandparents. According to Rostislav, the children were approximately 6 and 14 years old. Rostislav saw that Denis and Azia were lying in the bathroom, crushed collapsed wall. Azia died in my arms, says Rostislav. Denisa was covered with even more debris. He screamed in pain, he was in shock. Rostislav pulled Denis out from under the rubble. The nurse put Denis on an IV, hoping to save him. But an hour later he also died. Rostislav laid the bodies of Denis and Azia on the sofa and left them in destroyed apartment. It was too dangerous to bury them. Raven was constantly under fire. We realized that we needed to run as quickly as possible, says Rostislav. And he and the other men cried because they could not save injured. The next day Rostislav left Mariupol. Risking his life, he walked 30 kilometers. His hometown, bombings and shelling were left behind. Rostislav was lucky. In the first half of March 22, it was possible to get out of the besieged city, almost impossible. Attempts to organize the evacuation of the civilian population were met with opposition from the Russian country and at the last moment as invariable broke down. In addition, according to the Ukrainian authorities, the Russian military is not humanitarian aid was allowed into the city. Despite the fact that fighting was still ongoing in Mariupol, on March 14, as the parties reportedly agreed to a ceasefire. In both the second half of March and April, tens of thousands of people were able to leave the city by car towards Zaporozhye. And some, like Rostislav, walked. Those who were lucky and had a running car gathered in convoys. Mira Avenue 42 was just one of the collection points, according to several hundred cars, and drove out of the city together in search of relatively safe place. It was less than 300 kilometers to Zaporozhye, but it often took 2-3 days, since Russian and pro-Russian troops set up dozens of checkpoints along the road, where people leaving were searched, interrogated and sometimes detained. It was hardest for the elderly, the disabled, the wounded and those who accompanied them. Only on April 30 did the official evacuation of the civilian population begin from Mariupol to territory controlled by Ukrainian troops. With the assistance of the UN and the International Red Cross, civilians within a week they were taken out of Mariupol. Many were forced to flee, leaving their dead loved ones without burial. The bodies lay wrapped in carpets, on benches, along the walls, folded in a bunch behind garages. With the arrival of heat, the situation became even more terrifying. The bodies began to decompose, and in many areas of the city there was an unbearable smell. In Mariupol, seeing a corpse on the street is already a common thing. This is how Elena describes the apocalyptic spectacle that opened to her from windows of an evacuation bus. Leaving the city, we saw how everything around was burnt and black. Our city no longer existed. According to the mayor of Mariupol, Oleg, appointed by the occupation authorities, Morgan, until February 2023, from under the rubble they continued to recover the remains of the dead. During the assault on Mariupol in the following months, people died in the city. Thousands of people, some were killed directly during the fighting, and some died due to lack of clean water or proper medical care. Having analyzed 5 mass grave sites in Mariupol and its surroundings, the authors of the report found that in the period from March 22 by February 23, at least 10,284 people were buried in the city. It is not possible to determine how many of them are military personnel and how many are civilians. Managed. This is a minimum estimate of the number of people buried, and the real number of deaths during this period is almost certainly significantly higher, because not all remains were extracted from the rubble, and in some graves they were stored immediately. Several phone numbers in addition. Some wounded and sick may have managed to leave cities and died were buried outside it. To establish the exact number of deaths or fatalities during this period, it will likely take many years of painstaking work. Experts from Human Rights Watch, C2 Research and True Hounds have identified there are 4 cemeteries in the city where the number of graves has increased significantly. Starokrymskoy, Novotroitskoy, Pavlovskoy and Vinogradnoy Cemetery. Thousands of people were buried in these 4 cemeteries, either individual graves or in trench-type graves. In addition, the authors discovered hundreds of burials in a cemetery in Mangushi on the way out of Mariupol. Thousands are buried in cemeteries, and the identities of many are still unknown. Installed. Stefania's 4 relatives died on Metropolitan 98, but she only managed to find her granddaughter Arina. Stefania thinks about the rest of her relatives that they are buried in one of these cemeteries. I feel like they're here, she says, I have to find them. A large number of people is aggravated by the fact that the city, as they say, loses his face. Before the Russian invasion, the Mariupol Drama Theater was an iconic cultural center. The pediment of the theater was decorated with statues of a carpenter, a miner and a farmer, personifying the main professions of the region and standing surrounded by muses. On New Year's holidays the theater was always crowded. Mariupol residents came to admire the square decorated with illumination. As soon as Russian troops began storming the city, the theater, like others cultural sites, initially turned into a bomb shelter. People hoped that the theater building, officially declared a shelter for civilian population, will protect them from bomb bullets. But they were wrong. On March 16, 22, hundreds of people took refuge in the theater. Outside on the asphalt it was written in huge white paint, the word, children. The inscription was clearly visible from any flying. It can also be seen on satellite images. Civilians, including many children, were hiding inside the building. For long days they entered and left the theater, cooked food on the street and collected water, received it in the square in front of entrance of humanitarian aid, which was brought by the Ukrainian military and volunteers. On March 16, shortly before noon, Maxim saw an approaching plane. He was flying from the east, from the direction of Azovstal. Having approached Mira Avenue, the plane began to descend and then dropped 2 bombs. At that moment Natalia Kachenko had just entered the building with streets where I collected water from the tank. Suddenly I felt a gust of wind, and then I got stuck in something eyes and mouth, says Natalia. I grabbed my friend. As a result of the bombing, the central part of the roof was destroyed, as well as central parts of the northern and southern walls. I saw an elderly woman slowly crawling out of the basement, Natalia says. I went outside and saw a young blonde. Covered in blood. There was debris everywhere. I saw legs sticking out from under the rubble in one place and in another hand. Human Rights Watch staff was able to reliably confirm that when the bombing killed at least 15 people. But the exact number of deaths has not yet been established. Over the next year, the Russian occupation authorities almost the theater building was completely demolished and the area was surrounded by a high fence. A facade with huge 2-story portraits was stretched onto a metal frame. Russian and Ukrainian classics Pushkin, Tolstoy, Gogol and Shevchenko, who has traditionally been considered a symbol of the Ukrainian struggle for sovereignty. In May 2023, the authorities of the so-called Donetsk People's Republic, DPR, published on its website a list of buildings to be demolished. In Mariupol, it is planned to demolish 459 buildings, of which 148 are in the central parts of the city. The analysis shows that as of February 9, 2023, in the central part, at least 66 multi-story buildings were demolished in Mariupol, injured during the assault. In June 2023, two Russian companies, MST and Geostroy 2010, started demolishing the house on Mitropolitskaya 98, in the basement of which Irina and her family died. When a photo and footage taken from a passing car were posted on Telegram video showing that on the site of House 98 on Metropolitan all that was left was a pile of rubbish, one of the former residents wrote, "Now only memories." Human Rights Watch staff examined satellite images of this district. As of the end of June 23, there was nothing left of the house. Occupation authorities and the contractors they hired to carry out difficult work, the millionth was transported from Mariupol to suburban landfills, tons of construction waste. The Russian authorities plan to release what is left of the houses and personal property of Mariupol residents for processing. Received materials for construction work in the occupied city. In February, the Russian-controlled Mariupol 24 TV channel Occupation Authorities published news on his Telegram channel story, which states that it is planned annually at the test site process 1.5 million tons of construction waste, which formed as a result of repair and restoration work, including the dismantling of buildings and structures. The resulting fractions from the processing of recyclable materials will be used in construction, adds presenter Natalia Natsakanyan. In August 2022, the Russian Ministry of Construction announced that it intends to restore Mariupol in 3 years. With the support of the head of the DPR Denis Pushilin, a plan was approved, which, according to commissioned by the Russian Ministry of Construction, developed by the Russian Unified Institute Spatial Planning. The plan provides that by 2025 in Mariupol there will no longer be 150,000 inhabitants, as at the moment, but 350. By 2030, 450. By 2035, now hundreds of thousands of Mariupol residents are forced to live outside their cities. Some of them had to leave for other regions of Ukraine, and some are abroad as refugees. However, some of the city's residents are still considered missing. The exact number is unknown. Some of them probably died, and some moved voluntarily or forced to Russia. On February 25, 23, Russian authorities, to mark the anniversary of the beginning full-scale invasion, staged at Moscow's Luzhniki Stadium magnificent concert. In front of thousands of cheering spectators, children from Mariupol. As the British Guardian newspaper reported, some refugees from Mariupol recognized their acquaintances in these children. A few weeks later, on March 19, a little over a year after how Russian troops began their assault on Mariupol, 2 days after how the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin on suspicion of committing war crimes, including illegal deportation and transfer of Ukrainian children, the Russian president unexpectedly arrived in Mariupol. Having arrived at night by helicopter, Vladimir Putin then drove along the Avenue Mira, toward the city, visited the most important objects and got acquainted with plan, as the occupation authorities put it, construction and restoration work. Next, Putin inspected the building located next to the destroyed drama theater building of the Mariupol Philharmonic. Chief conductor Vasily Krychak fled from Mariupol in April 22, and now he is working in Kyiv to create a new orchestra. Most of the musicians from the Mariupol Philharmonic also fled cities and dispersed around the world. The Russian occupation authorities present construction work as some kind of urban renaissance. But many Mariupol residents believe that the ongoing construction is an attempt to destroy their history. There are some memories associated with every fence, every corner. From local residents. When memory is erased, childhood disappears, your home disappears. Where are you already? You can never go back. People exchange information about what is happening with their houses in which they once lived. Will they be repaired, or are the occupation authorities planning to demolish them and send for recycling? Some buildings are still standing. Their empty frames are not my reminder of what can never be returned. In February 2023, shortly before the house on Metropolitan Street was finally demolished, one woman wrote in a Telegram chat former residents. "It doesn't matter to me anymore whether our house will be restored or given another housing. The main thing for me is to have somewhere to live. I'm just tired. There are other changes happening in the city. Teachers are forced to sign documents stating that they are ready to switch to teaching according to the Russian school curriculum. The story is presented from the Kremlin's perspective. Ukraine is portrayed as a state that is neither sovereign, neither independent. The training program for Ukrainian schoolchildren will be adapted, said reportedly, in June 22, Russian Education Minister Sergei Kravtsov. The occupation authorities renamed many streets and squares, returning them Soviet names. For example, Mira Avenue is now again called Lenin Avenue, reminiscent of the times of the Soviet Union, when Ukraine was under by the authorities of Moscow. Television programs that were previously broadcast in Ukrainian now they are published in Russian. Internet access is provided through Russian servers, and access to Ukrainian sites are blocked. As in other occupied territories, anyone who dares resist these changes or will oppose the war and occupation faces detention, imprisonment, or violent disappearance. While the Dome authorities are building a new Mariupol according to the Russian model, the war in Ukraine continues. Residents of Mariupol and those who fled from the city were scattered around the world, and those that remain talk about the fear that the storming of the city and the damage it caused would be forgotten. In addition, they are afraid that they themselves will forget. They will forget the room in which grown up. They will forget the number of the bus they went to work on. They will forget how we went to performances at the drama theater. For Stephanie, whose entire family died under the rubble of House 98 on Metropolitan, there is nothing more but memories. She reverently reviews the videos saved on her phone, where all her loved ones are alive and happy. This is exactly what she remembers Arina Antipenko, not like a tiny body buried in cold earth, but like a glowing one from the joy of the child whom she adored and who is now forever. There will be 3 years left. Stefania says that her daughter Christina comes to see her almost every night. Her in a dream, Stefania is still attached to Mariupol, although she died here family. Her daughter loved Mariupol. It was there that Arina was born. It was there that Ivan worked, dreaming of saving money for Mitya's house. For your family, Stefania loved to walk around the city with Christina, admiring its architecture, numerous parks and lush flowers. The city was beautiful, Stefania sighs, but now it's just blackness. However, Stefania still returned to Mariupol and brought flowers to Mitropolitskaya 98, on the place where the house used to stand. Stefania says that this is the only place where she can come and pray. This is my children's city, she says.